This presentation is about conflict resolution and leadership, or an introduction to leadership. We're trying very hard to talk about leadership in the physiotherapy program now, and as well as this presentation, my colleague Anita Watson's done some really interesting stuff on leadership, which is also on Blackboard, so please have a look at that as well. We're going to talk about what leadership is and how it's relevant to you as a student or a Band 5 or Band 6 physiotherapist. We're going to talk about the concept of compromise, how to control your responses and those of others, and how to react ethically and professionally when crises occur. This is going to be available as a PowerPoint with audio accompanying each slide, so you can play it in your own time. And I'm going to put it on YouTube as well. It is quite word heavy, so there aren't many illustrations. It's just the nature of this subject, I think. So it may be the kind of thing that you can listen to when you are dozing off or driving, as long as it's not going to make you fall asleep, obviously. So first of all, let's talk about leadership. There's always an ongoing debate about whether leaders are born or made, and we can all think of famous leaders from history. Just got a few examples here. We've got Alexander the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte, outstanding military leaders, very charismatic. Alexander the Great was in charge of the Macedonian army and had won his first major battle by the age of 18. Napoleon conquered a vast amount of the world, escaped from exile a couple of times. Famous quote here from a philosopher called Plutarch: "And when Alexander saw the breadth of his domain, he wept, for there were no more worlds to conquer." That tells you how ambitious Alexander the Great was and what a great leader he was. Also, this is a quote from a famous film. Have a think about if you can recognize where this film is. And yes, it's used in the film Die Hard, Alan Rickman playing Hans Gruber. Traditionally, it was always thought that great leaders were born into leadership, certainly in royal families. Genghis Khan, the first emperor of the Mongol Empire, was born apparently with a blood clot in his hand as a baby, and that was seen as an omen that he was going to be a great leader and very powerful. Also, interestingly enough, 1 in 200 men in the world are now descended from Genghis Khan, so he got around. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to have to act like Genghis Khan on placement. That wouldn't go down too well. But you are going to come across situations where you're going to have to take leadership. I just think it's interesting to think about this for a second, because sometimes students say, "Oh, I'm not going to be a leader." But it's quite interesting. Those of you that know me will know that nearly all of my job is spent dealing with first-year undergraduate students who have no confidence on the whole and need a lot of support and encouragement, which is fine. But gradually you start to take on the mantle of a leader. So by the time you get into the second year, you're then helping us with interviews, and the new first years are seeing you as leaders. And then when you start on placement, you're kind of at the bottom of the pile again, but very quickly you work your way up. So before you know it, you do take on a leadership role. And certainly with your patients or clients, you will be seen as a leader. There are loads of quotes on the web and in books about leadership, and I've just picked out 3 here. So President John F. Kennedy said that leadership and learning are indispensable to each other. In other words, you never stop learning, and even great leaders make mistakes. Mahatma Gandhi said that, "I suppose leadership at one time meant muscles, but today it means getting along with people." So that kind of hints at the art of compromise. And then Lao Tzu, who is a Chinese philosopher, said that a leader is best when people barely know he exists. When his work is done, his aim fulfilled, they will say, "We did it ourselves." So sometimes you can lead from afar or from the distance. You don't have to be in the front line. Probably when you're reading this, you are still in your first year of undergraduate physiotherapy education, which is tough. You've got a lot of things coming at you. The last thing you're thinking about is becoming a leader. But we need to start thinking about this for the reasons that I said before. You are starting to lead your patients and lead clients. So I've just written 4 examples here. Even over the next month, as your career as a physiotherapy student, you might be expected to lead presentations, lead breakout rooms on Collaborate. I'm recording this in the middle of the COVID pandemic. Over your first year, you might be expected to lead other people, so you might be helping us with open days or interviews. You might be taking a leadership role there and talking to the students about how you got onto the program. On clinical placement, you might be given a ward to look after, you might be given some patients of your own to look after. And as a band 5, you'll have your own caseload, so it kind of progresses logically. I will put these on Blackboard, but there are some very useful resources about leadership in the NHS. I just wanted to give you these links, and I'm going to leave them on here for a few seconds. The NHS have also produced a 9-point leadership model. I'm not going to insult your intelligence, you can all read. Again, I'm going to leave this on the screen for a few seconds. So let's move on to how we manage conflict. We all experience conflict at various times in our lives and during the working day, and it's important that we understand why it happens and how we ourselves deal with it, and whether we have the best approach for dealing with stress and conflict or not. In an ideal world, everybody gets along, but at the moment it's far from an ideal world. We're all in self-isolation, people are scared, people are losing their jobs. As a physiotherapist, you'll be dealing with people who are in pain, people who are frightened and losing their jobs and worried about the future. So it's not surprising that you will come across conflict with your clients, your patients, and your colleagues as well. There's no single one-size-fits-all for how we should or do deal with conflict. People tend to deal with things in their own way, which presumably is the way that they found through trial and error which works best for them. And I think that's largely influenced by our personality type. I was thinking when I was preparing this presentation about my own way of dealing with conflict. I'm not proud to say this, but I consider myself to be a very, very patient man. It takes an awful lot to get me angry, so I have a long fuse, which is the first diagram here. If things start to anger me, I start to simmer like the pot in the middle, and then once a decade I will go nuclear. So it doesn't happen very often. I do have a limit. I think everybody does, and that's just the way that I deal with things, and that seems to work for me. I think maybe because I, in my role, need to be kind of soft and fluffy and approachable, that's fine, and I think I'm good at that. But there are occasions when you need to go nuclear, just to let people know that they've crossed a line or that they've angered you or upset you. I'm glad to say it's about once a decade, and I'm not due for another couple of years. I think we're into the nature-nurture debate. I think we probably watch our parents and siblings and families and work out how they deal with conflict, and probably pick up good or bad habits from the people around us. I don't know whether this has been researched or not, but you certainly do spend so much time with your siblings and parents, some of it is bound to rub off. It also depends whether you're invested in the issue, what your value systems are. If you're in a conflict about something that you don't particularly have a feeling for or have an axe to grind, you're more likely to be very passive about things and just let things go. But if it's something you feel very strongly about, your outcome is going to be very different. You're going to take a different approach. I'm sure you've seen this already, but there are some people that almost go looking for a conflict, and some people actively avoid conflict. And you can kind of put people into various categories, which is not always the best thing to do, but we do that because that's the way that humans deal with life, I think. Some people are what's called passive aggressive. They won't approach you directly, but they might have an alternate way of getting the point across. They maybe struggle to express their anger, and they may suppress it and then erupt when the fuse is blown. I just try to think about some of the potential conflicts that we all experience day to day at the moment. So there might be conflict in the community. At the moment, we're in a lockdown. I went out today. Some people are not obeying social distancing. Some people are not obeying the lockdown rules. I went out for valid reasons, I might add. Economic conflict, financial arguments is always a big one. Emotional conflict, we've all got relatives who are vulnerable maybe to COVID, and that causes conflict. How do we look after these family members? Group conflict, whenever you put people together, there will be different opinions. You'll find that also when you start to do presentations on your program, people will have different views. Interpersonal conflict, military conflict obviously is war. Racial conflict, unfortunately, still evident in a lot of parts of the world. Relationships are always tricky, they always come to the forefront. Conflict in the workplace, I work in a fantastic team of very dedicated people, but it's a fairly high pressured environment, and sometimes you do snap at people, and I think it's because we just want the best for people. Conflict with colleagues, academics, you might have conflicts with your clinical educators, and you might have conflicts with other members of the MDT. There are lots of different theories and models about how people manage conflict and resolve it, and probably one of the simplest ones I think to understand is Thomas and Kilman's. So you've got these two axes ranging from unassertive to assertive, and then uncooperative to cooperative, and within that you've got these 5 different chunks. You've got competing, collaborating, compromising, avoiding, and accommodating. If you are being collaborative, you need to meet the needs of the people involved. So the module that I'm doing this for is a collaborative module where we have different professions. It works really well, but it means that we need to communicate very carefully with each other about what we all bring to the table. You can be assertive and collaborative, but it's also important that if you're trying to be collaborative, that you acknowledge the role of everybody, and sometimes that's not always easy. Collaboration's probably best when you have a very complex situation where there is no black and white answer, or when there's a previous history of conflict in a group that hasn't been resolved, or when something is just too important to make a snap decision. We need to come up with a reasoned decision. Some people and some occasions call for a much more competitive approach, and these are the situations where people tend to drive with their own goals, their own drivers to gain some end product. They usually are in a position of power and try to pull rank on you. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes that's what you need. In a military situation, you need somebody at the top of the tree to make decisions. Another example may be at a major crime scene or an accident where you need one person to make decisions, and then the whole team knows what the direction of those decisions are. Compromise is kind of finding the middle ground. I must confess that I've always tried to do this in my life, and sometimes it works and sometimes it just causes more harm than good. I can think of a few occasions where I've tried to please everybody and ended up pleasing nobody. But there are occasions where a compromise is the right thing to do. Accommodation means, well, in physiology, when a nerve accommodates, it gets used to something and it stops transmitting quite as frequently. So in this context, accommodation means getting used to somebody else's views and going with it. So it's kind of the opposite of a competitive style. And again, there are occasions where it's easier to just give in and go with the flow. Some people will actively avoid conflict. These people tend to be unassertive or uncooperative, but not always. They will often delegate controversial decisions to somebody else. That might be appropriate. We said before that there's no one size that fits all. Sometimes it's easier just to not get involved, or it may be that somebody else is better qualified or in a better position to deal with the situation, and that's fine. That's not a sign of weakness. I think one of the things about being professional that we've talked about is knowing what your limitations are and when somebody else is better placed to deal with the situation. And as the slide here says, basically this is dealing with the problem by not dealing with the problem. There was some interesting research about 20 years ago now by Antonioni, who found that outgoing, conscientious and agreeable people and people who are open tended to handle conflict in a more positive way, and they tended not to use avoidance, and they usually found a constructive way to deal with a problem. I wanted to talk a little bit about how to communicate responsibly, effectively and ethically, mainly when you're on placement or working with your colleagues or academics. One of the greatest problems, probably, and the greatest cause of conflict and problems with the NHS and clinical placement and between students and lecturers is a lack of clarity. And we've all done this. We all try to present things very clearly. We think we've done a good job, and then it turns out that the students have either misheard us or misinterpreted what we've said, or just not understood it because it wasn't as clear as we thought it was. So communication is obviously a two-way street, and we need to both understand what each other is after or saying if we are to avoid conflict. And just as a summary slide here, I've put down the 4 things that we've just talked about: the passive, the aggressive, the assertive and the avoidance. I've always thought that the best physiotherapists are the ones that can adapt and change their behaviour, their speech, their pronunciation, their attitude to fit the situation, and this probably applies to conflict as well. There are occasions where you have to take the lead and be dominant and be assertive, but then there are occasions when you need to take a back seat, and I think the problem comes when you don't recognise a situation, when you can't read the situation. That's when students tend to have problems on placement. I just wanted to present 6 variables here that might be useful to think about when you are faced with a conflict. Now the problem is that, as you know, conflicts tend to arise immediately, so you've not got time to go and study. One of the things that might be worth thinking about is to not make any decisions early on and go and reflect and think about how you're going to handle the conflict before you get back to somebody. The first and perhaps most obvious thing is, how invested in a relationship are you? So by relationship, I mean the conflict really. Is it something that's not really your problem, or is it something that's going to have a direct bearing on what you do? Similarly, how important is this issue to you? Is it something that you feel very passionately about, or is it something that you've been embroiled in that isn't really something that you should be getting involved in? Do you have the energy for the conflict? Now this reads as though I'm saying that you should roll over and give up. Actually, sometimes avoiding a conflict is the best thing to do, because if you know that you're going to get very stressed by getting involved in an issue that you know is not going to get better anyway, sometimes a very good coping strategy is to walk away. And I sometimes employ that, and it takes a lot to do that, but sometimes to walk away protects you. Also think, if possible, in the long term, what are the consequences of becoming embroiled in a conflict? So it could backfire, it could affect your relationships with your colleagues. You spend a lot of time with your colleagues at work. You don't need to have a bad relationship with your colleagues. Is it worth getting involved? Are you ready for the consequences? Well, it may be yes, it may be no. It may be that if you appear to be very passionate about something, you suddenly get dumped with a lot more work because people recognize that you're very passionate about a topic and involved with it. So think carefully before you become embroiled in any conflict, really. Similarly, if you don't get involved, is that going to cause problems? So we talk a lot in our program about whistleblowers and being ethical and reporting and duty of care, that kind of thing. There will be occasions when you'd rather not get involved, but you have to. So just think about whether it's the right thing to do to get involved. And sometimes, even though you don't want to, it will be the right thing to get involved. Again, you can all read, but I just thought it was worth presenting these steps in conflict resolution. So the first thing to do is define what the problem is. That's probably more important than we realise. Sometimes we miscommunicate and there actually isn't a problem. We're both saying the same thing. Then one of or both of us need to suggest a solution. We then need to evaluate that solution. It may be that we then need some form of compromise. It may be that we then need some form of brainstorming to try and come up with a reasonable solution. And if that doesn't work, you're kind of looking at a third party to mediate things. Certainly as a healthcare professional, you will come across conflict on a regular basis. So I've just jotted down here some of the things that I think might make your life a little bit less traumatic. I think it's important that you do accept compromise. We don't live in a perfect world. People all need to be flexible and willing to adapt to a degree. You also need to be robust and defend your own views and be honest about what you need and what you want, at the same time as working together. Also stay on focus, don't lose the plot, don't change the subject, face the conflict, don't avoid it. I think generally speaking, people who avoid conflict go away and fester, and it only gets worse. These things very rarely die down. And also put yourself in other people's shoes, and I think this is something that we're all guilty of. We all think that we are busier than somebody else. We could do things better than somebody else. But just put yourselves in the shoes of that person and you'll probably find that you wouldn't handle things any differently than they do. It's also important that you kind of know a little bit of psychology about the person that you're dealing with. And very, very broadly, you can divide people into two groups, very broadly. You've got the imposters and the Dunning-Krugers. The Dunning-Kruger effect is really interesting, and you will come across this. This is when people have no clue about their inability to do something. I believe it gets its name from a case in America. A guy was robbing a bank and he walked into the bank and he was filmed on high definition closed circuit TV. The police went to his house and picked him up. When they went to his house, he was quite shocked. And he said, "How did you find me?" And they said, "Your face is on CCTV and somebody recognized you." And he said that must be impossible because he'd read an article that if you wanted to make invisible ink, you could use lemon juice. So he'd squished lemon juice over his head in the hope that that would make him invisible so that he wouldn't show up on the security cameras. And I believe the guys that documented this were called Dunning and Kruger. If that's not correct, let me know, but I believe that's the case, and you will come across people who exhibit the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the problem with Dunning-Krugers is that they are so convincing, they will convince you that they are right, and most people will go along with that. So just watch out for the Dunning-Krugers. Now, obviously, this is slightly light-hearted, and I'm sorry about the word stupid here, but we have Dunning-Krugers who are at the pinnacle of Mount Stupid. And then probably more common, certainly in the students that I've met over the years, it's far more common to see students who have the imposter syndrome. I look after the first years and I have done for 20 years now, and I love it. But one of the things that's a bit upsetting is that when they come in on the first day, and you probably did this yourself, you look around the room and you can see people comparing yourselves to others and thinking, I'm not as clever as them, I'm not as good as them, they've got A-level biology, I don't, they've done a degree, I don't know anything. It's very common in our profession. Actually, that's not a bad thing in a way because it makes you driven and makes you want to study. But when you see it, and I know how good you guys are, it can be quite upsetting. So that's called imposter syndrome, when somebody just doesn't believe that they are good enough. Just wanted to go through some of the negative ways that people might resolve conflict. We all tend to want to prove that we are right and somebody else is wrong. We will sometimes blow up in people's faces. If things get really bad, people will be deceptive and maybe stretch the truth a little bit. Sometimes people will actually lie to get their point across. And probably the commonest in philosophy is what's called an ad hominem attack. That means when somebody's in a situation when they are losing an argument, they will make a personal attack on that person rather than the topic of the discussion. Once somebody does that, you kind of know that they're on sticky ground and they're starting to lose the argument. The problem with trying to prove that you're right, even though you might be right, is that people just tend to prove that they are right, and the whole thing escalates and there is no resolution. Bagging, as the name suggests, is when somebody bags up emotions and keeps them, and the anger and resentment tends to build. The problem then is that it becomes very difficult for people to think clearly, and the next time there's a conflict, the whole bag gets opened again. Blowing up at people certainly doesn't help. It might involve crying, screaming, shouting, stamping your feet, other exhibitions of anger. I think once you get to that point, you've almost lost your argument. I think once people start to be deceptive, it really hurts people, and you're going to lose a relationship with a colleague. Once you've done it, it's almost impossible to get any kind of honest relationship going again. And an extension of that is actually lying, and you will come across that, unfortunately, on some occasions. A personal attack, an ad hominem attack, is very common, and I think it goes back to our desire to protect ourselves. You know, the best form of defense is attack sometimes. I hope you found that presentation useful. I hope I've given you some tips about how to manage conflict. Don't forget that if you do experience conflict on your program, you are surrounded by a very, very experienced and very helpful team of lecturers, and you can also get a lot of support from the university generally and your colleagues.